what's really interesting, Kirby, is if you ask a spiritually curious person, what do you think happens when you die? Half of them tell us that they believe that they will be accountable to God or a higher power for the way that they live their life.
We oftentimes talk about evangelism and apologetics here, and a lot of our apologetics are really geared towards people that are agnostic or atheist. These people are a little bit more open to those ideas. They may be spiritually curious, and so that's why we want to spend some time today talking about this book. It's been out a couple of months, Faith for the Curious. It is written by Mark Matlock, and he is the Executive Director of Urbana 2025 for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. Also, a Senior Fellow at Barna, and Barna Research is a group that we, of course, talked about many times in the past. He's the founder of Wisdom Works, which has helped national, international faith-based organizations adapt to some of the changes taking place. You may be familiar with him with his previous book, co-authored with Dave Kinnaman, Faith for Exiles. This one, Faith for the Curious, and the foreword by David Kinnaman. Mark Matlock, welcome to Point of View.
Hey, great to be with you today.
Let's, if we can, maybe kind of get into some of this for those who are listeners to Point of View, especially those who give to the Truth Team. I'm holding up right now the made booklet that I created, which was all about individuals who identify themselves as spiritual but not religious. And we get into some of those ideas, which are oftentimes identified by certain people working in the field. Certainly Pew Research and others have even given them a designation that actually is SBNR, spiritual but not religious. In some respects, I think some of these people that are, if you will, the curious, the faithful, curious individuals are individuals that are spiritually open but certainly aren't plugged into a church. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of similarities between the group you just mentioned. The one difference would be that we actually measured curiosity using a curiosity scale that looked at how actively people were seeking spiritual things. So we actually narrow that group down just a little bit in terms of how much they're leaning into understanding the spiritual world around them versus maybe being more passive about it.
Well, let's, if we can, kind of define the terms, because first of all, we recognize that church identity is on the decline. The rise of the unaffiliated, oftentimes called the spiritual nuns, has been on the increase. And so 2 in 5 U.S. adults are non-practicing Christians. Now, when you get to spiritual curiosity, as you point out, you actually looked at this curiosity scale from those who have high curiosity, about 38%, those who have moderate curiosity, another 38%, and then those who have low curiosity. And you really identified a couple of people, curious skeptics and spiritually curious. Can you kind of explain who those are? Because in some respects, they're very close to one another, aren't they?
Yeah, they both believe that there is likely more out there. The spiritually curious definitely believe there is more out there. The curious skeptics believe there is, but they're not always convinced that they can know that for certain. And the spiritually curious are they're more actively exploring spiritual practices. Curious skeptics are very much open to it, positive about it. They may not be as actively engaging in spiritual practices like tarot card reading, meditation and mindfulness, different kinds of things like that, crystals, things that we would associate with outside of, the biblical framework for how we engage the supernatural.
And one of the things that I wish I'd created this for the individuals watching online, but as you get the book, you can see that there is a graph and a chart. On the y-axis is curiosity, on the x-axis is supernaturalism. On the far left-hand side, you'd have the naturalists. These would be the atheists that are pretty much closed off to the belief in spiritual realm. One of the reasons why the most recent Lee Strobel book on spirituality has a first section to try to show individuals that there is a supernatural realm, there is more to life than life, but those would be on one extreme. The other extreme, of course, would be practicing Christians who believe in the supernatural and may have a higher level of curiosity. But in between, you've got the spiritually curious, which we're going to spend most of our time talking about. Those are people, I guess, that would not necessarily be part of the Christian church. They either are non-Christians or non-practicing Christians. And then the curious skeptics that are at least sort of open to the ideas. And in some respects, we have neglected those because we've sort of gone to one extreme or the other, haven't we? Sometimes, Mark, assuming either you're in the church, you're out. Either you're interested in Christianity or you're not. But I think this book is really an attempt to identify a very significant number of people in the middle who may be spiritually curious, maybe even curious skeptics, and those are the people we really need to reach out to.
Yeah, we're looking at about 67% of the unchurched population is in that spiritually curious realm. 74% of all Americans tell us that they would like to grow spiritually. So there's definitely an attitude that's very different than when we're thinking about that 10% that we call the naturalists in the Faith of the Curious. That group is, but what I've found is that most Christians tend to think of the unchurched as that naturalist group, because a lot of our apologetics is written about that group. A lot of the way that sometimes we talk about or we see people that are hostile toward Christianity, they tend to belong in that group of people, and we miss the fact that there's this huge number of people, 67%, of our population that actually are kind of like, I'm exploring a spiritual upgrade. I think that's an important thing too that we found when we looked at the spiritually curious. And for the sake of the conversation, I'm going to include the spiritually curious and the skeptics, that 67%. I'm just going to include that into one group and not nitpick it for our time. But one of the things about that group is that they're looking for an upgrade. They've experienced something in their life, the image of God in them in some way. They're creative. They're experiencing intimacy. They're experiencing love, generosity, maybe a sense of injustice. And part of the image of God is showing up in them, but because of sin, they're not able to fully realize that. And they've figured out that money and education can't quite get them that far, so they're turning to spirituality and some kind of practice to hopefully mend that. Now, we know as Christians, the only way that you're really going to experience the image of God is to be fully renewed and transformed through faith in Jesus Christ and death and resurrection.
And Mark, you were talking about some of the aspects of that, and there's a section in which you talk about the spiritually curious and give us, 8 different characteristics. And that, I think, is helpful because sometimes people are so kind of locked into either they're a Christian or they're a non-Christian, and there's a whole group of individuals, matter of fact, seems to be an increasing group of individuals that have some openness to the supernatural, know that life seems to be a little bit missing something, and are curious and looking for that. And here is why you wrote the book, isn't it?
Yeah, I just started having lots of interactions with people going, what's going on here? And also noticing in our research at Barna for several different groups that, there was this group of Americans, a large group, that didn't seem to be behaving the way a lot of us typically think of when we think about the people that we might share our faith with, that they're a lot more open and receptive, but maybe the way we engage them needs to have a little bit different nuance than maybe some of the way we've traditionally done it.
And so again, you're talking about spiritually curious ones, maybe don't have strong opinions about the supernatural, but believe it exists, open to experiences about the spiritual, maybe less inclined to be open to institutional religious experiences, which brings me to something I said in one of the other booklets on the next generation. We assume that if they're spiritually curious, they'll walk into the church, and I call that the field of dreams myth. If you build it, they will come. We've built 350,000 churches in America. The spiritually curious aren't necessarily going to walk in the back door of the church, are they?
I think like 20 years ago, inviting somebody to church would bring them in. But now we have to assume that there's probably 4 or 5 other steps before they even get to that place that they were 20 years ago. And so thinking about that place of meeting people where they're at and having those conversations, it's more like Nicodemus, in the middle of the night meeting with Jesus, or like, Jesus meeting the woman at the well. These are going to be things where we're meeting people in the places where they actually live and engaging these conversations. And most people are very open to having conversations. They're not necessarily interested in us preaching at them or telling them what we believe, but most of them have a spiritual story, and getting them to talk about it often leads to deeper conversations where Jesus comes in and meets them.
Let's talk about the warnings for just a minute, and I'm going to pull from some of your earlier book, Faith for the Exiles, because one of the things there is you found that these individuals, which we'll call spiritually curious, need safety around doubts and questions. In other words, screens disciple, you said, and in some respects, there is not just less inclination to go to church, there's even a very significant hesitation, and you surfaced some of that in your earlier book, Faith for Exiles, didn't you?
Well, one of the things, we're even finding this with Urbana, is that students are actually doing a lot of pre-work before they engage us as people, right? Like they're researching mission organizations before they ever come up to the booth or the table. They're doing their homework because that's kind of the environment that they've been brought up in. And so they're asking a lot of questions into Google about their faith. And so one of the things that we have to realize, especially those of us that are, in older generations, we might use the internet, but we probably don't lean into it as much as this other generation does as an initial form of exploration. My doctor, when I visited him recently, said, "So what do you think you have?" when he first walked into the office. And I was like, "What do you mean? What do I think? I'm here to find out from you." And he goes, "Well, I know you've already Googled all your symptoms, right?" So I thought, what a wise doctor. And I think that we have to have the same approach when we encounter somebody, to realize that they've probably already been on a spiritual journey. And it would be helpful for us to find out what that is before we start making any assumptions. So curious kind of calls to curious. And if we're curious about a person's spiritual backstory, we may find lots of opportunity to help them continue to go on the path toward Christ that they're already on, probably.
Well, again, you already tipped to the other one I want to talk about, and that is the do-it-yourself, the DIY culture that we're in. And, of course, your doctor understood that, but that's really what we are in. We're in a DIY culture in which I not only am going to go on YouTube or Instagram or a variety of other places to find information, but I'm also kind of doing it my DIY faith, isn't it? And that's, I think, another thing you're talking about there at Urbana as well.
Yeah, well, I think, an important thing, on this DIY thing is this isn't necessarily that I'm building my own faith in my own image. It could lead to that, but that's not what I'm getting at. What I'm really talking about is this idea of agency, that I'm the one who's doing the constructing and the exploration. So, as I'm working with pastors that are asking me, how do I appeal to the spiritually curious as a pastor? We kind of are used to going and holding up and doing all this research and then coming and presenting our sermon that kind of pulls it all together. The spiritually curious actually would like to be in your study while you're putting the sermon together, looking at the books you're reading, seeing the notes you discarded as well as what they're interested in the process, and they want to be able to investigate on that level. And so it kind of opens up the opportunity for things like, I find with spiritually curious people, it's sometimes helpful for me to be a co-learner with them, even if I know the answer or think I know the answer, to say, hey, let's explore what Jesus might say about this together, as opposed to just telling them what I think the answer already is. They're much more interested in that journey and that process.
And they're open to newness and uncertainty you talk about, because you have a very interesting graph here. Practicing Christians, I like to do things that are frightening or complex or challenging. No, they're always a little bit more reserved. But the spiritually curious, they're almost off the charts. And that is, I'm willing to do something that's unusual, frightening, unpredictable, challenging. And so in some respects, that desire for even a more intense experience is something that we've got to get used to as Christians dealing with this particular group of spiritually curious individuals.
It's really interesting, but I found that like a lot of times we try to make church more palatable or easy for people. And what the spiritually curious, they're actually looking for more intensity, like you said. And like I found with a group of teenagers that were meeting in my home, we decided that we were going to explore and practice prayer together. And we were going to explore the way different Christians have learned to pray throughout the centuries. So we kind of went back and studied some of the old ways of the Desert Fathers and things like that. And I was shocked, but they invited their friends to come that weren't Christians. And I was like, wow, like here we're doing something that's very risky, that's very bold, that's very different, maybe even a little awkward at times. But they were inviting their friends to that more than they were, hey, come hang out, have snacks, and we're going to do a light, Bible study kind of a thing. So that was what kind of started making me wonder, boy, are we maybe missing it? That really they are looking for something that really is connected to power and to the real presence of God in their lives.
The book is entitled The Faith for the Curious. Mark Matlock is our guest. One of the things, Mark, that I thought might be helpful is early on, you talk about some of the mistakes we could make, the mistake that the search of the curious to be finite, the mistake that the curious are wanting to find an expert or authority and that will solve the problem, or even mistakenly think that we need to close the deal or that we make it too difficult to trust in Jesus. It does seem to me that in some respects, we need to understand that we're dealing with people that are different than we are, and sometimes we need to sort of get out of our shell or out of our silo and begin to understand a little bit more about how they perceive the world and what kind of information or relationships they might need.
Yes, I think a lot of the ways that we've been trained to share our faith are great. They're designed to help us do it effectively, accurately, and efficiently, but sometimes not with our full self being present. And that's some of the mistakes that can be made, is knowing whether or not, we're always, it's all about bringing people to that point where we say, is there any reason why you couldn't trust Christ today? And I think that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, but I think we have to be careful that we realize that because there are probably like 5 or 6 extra steps in the current time that we live in toward people being able to make a decision, that we're okay with the fact that we may not be the last stop on their spiritual journey, and that we might really be sensitive to what God is wanting to do in that moment with us as we're talking to them, and not feel like we need to close the deal. Sometimes with our family members, when we get together with our non-believing family members, we're always, see this is our opportunity to put that question of Jesus in front of them, and it becomes exhausting for them, and we all of a sudden don't have any broader basis of relationship. And I'm finding that it takes, 5, 6, maybe even a dozen or more interactions with somebody before I'm able to actually ask them if they're ready to trust Christ, or they are ready to trust Christ. So I think we have to kind of set our expectations a little bit differently. But there's nothing wrong with saying that. I just think we need to be careful.
I think so. And the middle chapters there talk about the curious culture and the curious posture. Can maybe you explain some of that? Because once we understand the people that we're dealing with, maybe we will then not be inclined to make some of the mistakes you talk about.
Yeah, a big part of it has to do with this idea of always making the assumption that maybe God is already at work before we even encounter them. So that we want to discover that, I think, is really, really important in terms of that. And I think we have to look at ourselves, too, in terms of, we can be in such a transactional culture, and faith in Christ is more than a transaction. It's a true relationship with Jesus Christ. And so we need to be careful that we don't treat it in a transactional way, and that our friendships and relationships with the spiritually curious aren't based on whether or not they make a decision to follow Jesus or not. And that means really connecting with them in a deeper way. You know, we in the church have what we call a higher need for closure. Our research, we use the scale to measure that, which means, and there's nothing wrong with this. It's neither good nor bad. It just is what it is. It's neutral, but it means that we have a lower tolerance for ambiguity, for uncertainty, the unknown. And the spiritually curious have a higher sense of that by about 20 percentage points. So we are going to be less comfortable with ambiguity, and we're going to want to bring certainty in maybe sooner than they are ready for that. And what's certain for us may seem oversimplistic to them. They may not be in that place to trust. And a great example of that is the rich young ruler. He comes in and has his exchange with Jesus, and then he walks away. And I've always, been like, wow, Jesus didn't chase after him and say, hey, wait a minute. Let me keep, telling you what you need to know here. He kind of lets him go away. And I really believe one of the first things I'm going to do when I'm in heaven, by the way, it's on my top 5 list. I want to find out what happened to the rich young ruler, because I firmly believe that he came around, and Jesus knew he has to process this to get to a point where he really can trust me with his whole life. And we need to be careful that we don't give such short answers to things or certainties to things that people are asking questions about, that we don't turn them off.
Yes. And again, I love that fact that you do have this closure scale, which shows, again, that practicing Christians are more likely than any other faith group or even non-believing group to have a high need for closure or certainty, and that is the case. Let's, if we can, maybe just talk about how to engage the spiritually curious. And one of the more helpful sections, I thought, in that chapter had to do with defining sin, because sometimes, again, our definition and the way in which we try to communicate it isn't always biblical, but it certainly isn't helpful. Can you explain maybe?
Yeah, well, what's really interesting, Kirby, is if you ask a spiritually curious person, what do you think happens when you die? Half of them tell us that they believe that they will be accountable to God or a higher power for the way that they live their life. So, you've got a 1 out of 2 chance when you're talking to a person who's outside of the church that they actually feel morally responsible for the way that they're living their lives with some kind of eternal afterlife sense. So helping people understand what they believe sin is. We think of sins as a list of behaviors, but it's really our condition. And a lot of people outside of the church have come to know sin as specific behaviors and actions, and not necessarily a general condition that we're all born into. So helping people work through that and understand that. And I find that by just asking people questions about, do you believe that man is good or bad? What do you believe? Do you believe that we're accountable for the way we live our life? Will there be consequences, for the way that we live? Asking those kind of questions really pulls out of people what they believe or what they've never really thought much about, but maybe have some opinions on. That's a great way to be able to then talk about what the Lord believes, because most of the time people will say, well, what do you think? What do you believe? And that gives us an opportunity to share at their invitation, which is nice.
Yes. Well, another part of that is you talk about, and again, some of the surveys and the statistics that you have show that, again, this issue of judgment is certainly front of mind. They would like to listen without judgment. They imagine a Christian who would be interested in learning from that you're going to be less judgmental, not trying to force a conclusion, somebody who really is willing to understand me, maybe experiences some of these struggles, even demonstrates an interest in you. And that's, of course, what we've tried to teach people, but sometimes when it comes down to the rote way in which we oftentimes teach and treat evangelism, it doesn't come off that way, but that's certainly what you would expect a non-Christian or a spiritually curious individual to say about the interaction they would have with another Christian.
Yeah, I grew up in the church, and I can't remember a time when I didn't go to church. I literally believe maybe my mom gave birth to me in a pew during a service. But it was only when I was in high school, as I was reading the Bible, that I realized that while I stood and believed the things that Jesus stood for and believed to a certain extent to what I was capable of, I wasn't affecting people. I didn't have the same effect on people that Jesus had, where people were following him. People wanted to be around him. People were asking, bringing really deep problems to him. And I thought, what is it about me that's preventing that from happening? Why am I not being sought at in the way that Jesus? And that's when I realized that, if you miss Jesus, the heart of Jesus by just a degree, you're way off. And the Pharisees, who were probably the most like him theologically, in terms of their goals of holy living, many of them missed him when he was there in their midst. And so I really want us to think about, how am I affecting people in the way that Jesus affected people? That's really, I think, what's at the heart of all of this.
Yes.
And what people said they wanted out of spiritual conversations.
And let's, if we can, talk about the supernatural. A minute ago, I mentioned Lee Strobel, in his book, talks in that first half about the supernatural for the atheist or the agnostic or the skeptic. But the rest of it, I think, illustrated by the subtitle of his book, Investigating Angels, Demons, Mystical Dreams, Near-Death Encounters, the Unseen World. And if I think about this, Mark, this goes back to one of the research projects you did with Barna on teens and the supernatural, in which you found that a lot of these teenagers, even at a time when you had the Harry Potter books, the Harry Potter movies, you had all sorts of issues about the supernatural, not much was communicated from the pulpit, you found. And if you look at your chart here, the spiritually curious are quite likely to have read or looked at a horoscope, to have witnessed a miracle, to have their fortune told, to have their palm read, maybe to have used crystals and a variety of other things. So when we get into this issue of the supernatural, we may not necessarily be trying to convince them of the supernatural. We may really be trying to warn them about the dangers of it, and to say that you're looking for the supernatural, but you may be looking in the wrong place.
Well, yeah, it's kind of like when the Apostle Paul was standing on Mars Hill, where I actually was just there in Athens a couple of weeks ago, and he says, "I see that you are a very religious people," and he admires them for their spiritual prowess. And I think sometimes when we hear about people that are experimenting with crystals and things like that, we tend to evaluate them, and judge them and look negatively upon what they're doing or whatever, rather than saying, hey, you're really into this. What are you looking for when you're doing this? What are you hoping to find?
Right.
And connecting with that, and then showing how Jesus is a much better answer than maybe tarot cards or the stars in the sky. Hey, I'll introduce you to the one who put the stars in the sky. And so I think there's something about that that's really important, that we think about how we react to that.
Well, and again, you've got some great charts here. More than half of the spiritually curious have had a supernatural experience. Half of spiritually curious individuals have a traditional view of God, which I think most people were maybe a little bit surprised. And then back to that issue of ambiguity, the curious are content without answers. So in some respects, mindfulness, meditation, maybe even interacting at that level is maybe a different kind of evangelism, a different kind of apologetic. And in some respects, that's exactly why you wrote this book.
Yeah. I really was looking to help the church connect to the spiritual moment the broader culture seems to be in, and figure out how to use where people are at to bring them and introduce them to Jesus. And I think that's, the key reason I wrote the book. I just saw a lot of my fellow Christians, and even myself to some extent, struggling with how to understand where people are coming from. And I find that some of this framing and this thinking helps us just think a little bit differently about the people that we're engaging, and maybe takes a little bit of the fear out of talking about these things with people, because we find they're more open to talking about them. In fact, I find men really love talking about spiritual things. In fact, when I would go to neighborhood parties, my wife would always be like, stop talking about, you're always talking about spiritual things when we go to these, they're going to stop and buy us. I'm like, honey, I'm not bringing it up. They want to talk about it. They're coming to me with the thoughts and the questions and the conversation. And so I think we forget that people don't have a lot of places to have some of these conversations. And as long as we're willing to have an open conversation that isn't, once again, trying to drive to that conclusion, most people are willing to engage. In fact, I find most people that are spiritually curious ask me how they can follow Jesus or what that looks like, than me ever having to even open that door or ask that question, because they become very interested in it.
Let's just, before we go, first of all, mention that the book is available and people can find it in the bookstore, but also we have a link there to get it in hardback or Kindle. We also have a link to markmatlock.com. You are the wisdom hacker, as it says. And if people would like to get your blog, or they would like to get your subscription to some of the resources that you have available, and this would certainly get them started also on the journey that comes from the books, Faith for Exiles and Faith for the Curious, that's available at the website. But explain to people what they might be signing up for.
Yeah, I'd also recommend that people go to faithforthecurious.com.
Sure.
You can actually download a sample chapter from the book, and there's other resources available there for people who want that. But yeah, just I do infrequent mailings of things that I'm working on, things that I'm learning, to those that are interested in following those things. So that's kind of what I make available there at markmatlock.com.
Well, again, that is faithforthecurious.com, so you can find that as well. Of course, we have most of these links up there as well, including we, of course, have a link to your Instagram page where people can follow you as well, and any other social media that people might want to know about. So, first of all, I've always appreciated your writing, and I certainly appreciate the time and energy you put into this book, and I really appreciate you giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Kirby, always good to be with you. Thank you. Appreciate all you.
Once again, I might just remind you that as we talk about some of these issues, you may be trying to figure out, how can I witness to my friends, my neighbors, my coworkers? How can maybe the church be more effective in reaching out? And we want to be a resource in that regard. Well, hope you appreciated the conversation we had here today. And don't forget that if you would like more information about what we're talking about, you can find it at the website pointofview.net. That's all we have for today. We look forward to seeing you next time right here on Point of View Highlights.